Today I want to tell you a true story. Heck, I always tell you true stories, but the story for today starts with Peter Thiel, 22 years ago, a Stanford law graduate, running a small hedge fund in California that not many people have heard of, but also a co-founder of a company called PayPal. And if you ever send money to your friends or family, if you ever bought anything on eBay, it's likely that you use PayPal. Let me tell you how he grew $1,700 into $5 billion over 20 years without paying a single dollar in taxes. So how do you manage to grow $1,700 into $5 billion over 20 years without paying a single dollar in taxes? Well, you do that by using something that's called a Roth IRA, which is a type of retirement account in the United States. And because this concept is sometimes misleading, sometimes confusing, let's go on a 60-second history tour of how this account came to be and how this account works, because this is what Peter Thiel used very successfully. So 50 years ago, in the 70s and before that, pensions typically in the United States would be funded by the companies that you work for. They would have a pension fund that they would contribute to for you, and then when you retire, the company would pay you a pension. But of course, some companies failed, some companies underfunded these funds, and a lot of the times workers retired and there wasn't enough money to pay them the pension. And so over time, companies managed to shift this whole burden onto the workers themselves. And so in the 70s, in 1974, something called the traditional IRA, individual retirement account, was established for people to contribute themselves into an account that then they can invest and grows over time. And then they can use the money when they retire to withdraw money and effectively have their pension. So of course, over the next 20 years, politicians on the left and right realized that Americans are not saving enough. And in 1997, Senator William Roth, a Republican from Delaware, pushed for establishing what came to be known as a Roth IRA, a different type of individual retirement account, to, in his own words, help Americans, middle-class Americans, save for retirement tax-free. And so this is what the major difference is between the traditional retirement accounts and the Roth IRA. The traditional IRA, or the 401k plans that typically are run by the companies you work for, these are accounts where you contribute money pre-tax. So whatever you earn and whatever money you decide to contribute from your earnings go into these accounts before you pay any taxes, and only then you pay taxes on the remaining balance. And that money grows in these accounts, and then you end up paying taxes on whatever sits in that account when you retire and you start withdrawing money. The idea here being that when you finally retire, your income is much lower than it was when you were working, and therefore your taxes will be lower because the tax bracket is lower as well. With a Roth IRA, you don't defer the tax, just like in the traditional retirement accounts, but you completely eliminate it. And you eliminate it by paying it at the moment you contribute to the account. So you have a one-time payment of whatever you owe in taxes on the contribution, but then whatever grows in the account going forward, you don't pay any taxes on. So whatever you saved up and grew over the next 10, 20, 30 years, and you start withdrawing when you retire after you're 59 and a half years old, you don't have to pay any taxes on. So this is the type of account that Peter Thiel used very successfully, and I'm going to show you exactly how he did it. Let's go over a theoretical example of how this strategy actually works before we speak about Peter Thiel and his adventure with his Roth IRA and specific numbers that he had. So in this case, you open a Roth IRA and you contribute $1,000 to the account. Step number 2, you use that $1,000 to buy 1 million shares in a startup company, where you say that each of those shares is worth just a fraction of a penny per share. So in this case, each share will be $0.001 times 1 million shares, $1,000. Then a few years later, in our example here, the company goes public and the value of each of those shares goes up to $50. So now your Roth IRA is worth $50 million. $50 times 1 million shares. You have $50 million in your Roth IRA. So normally when you sell these shares, you would owe the IRS 20% of your gains. But since all of this is happening inside the Roth IRA, where any growth isn't taxed, you don't pay any taxes. So the next step, suddenly you have $50 million in your account, and you can invest those in other companies and replicate the same strategy, right? So when those companies go public or their stock increases in value, your Roth IRA account just keeps growing. And then finally, as long as you wait to cash out until you're 59 and a half years old, that money will effectively never be taxed. So how did Peter Thiel manage to turn $1,700 into $5 billion over 20 years? Well, in 1999, so 2 years after the Roth IRA came to be, he opens up his own Roth IRA account and he puts $1,700 in the account. And he uses that money to buy 1.7 million of PayPal shares. So PayPal at the time is a very young startup that he co-founded. And he's putting his founder's shares into his Roth IRA, paying 0.001 of a dollar for each share. So 1.7 million shares times 0.001 is $1,700. That's his contribution. And it's, by the way, it's below the limit, which at the time was $2,000. Today it's $6,000, but at the time the maximum limit you could contribute into a Roth IRA was $2,000. And then a year later, as PayPal grows, suddenly that money is worth 3.8 million. It's still a private company, but it's valued at obviously a much higher price. Then 2 years later, in 2002, eBay buys PayPal, and the share of the proceeds that Peter Thiel gets for this is $28.5 million. So $28.5 million that is sitting in his Roth IRA. If his shares were not in the Roth IRA, he would owe 20% in taxes to the IRS and another 9% to the state of California for the state taxes. But because it's all sitting inside the Roth IRA, he doesn't owe any taxes. So suddenly $1,700 from 1999 turns into $28.5 million in 2002 when PayPal is sold to eBay. And then obviously he continues deploying the same strategy. So in 2003, Thiel founds Palantir, which today is a company that's listed on the stock market, was listed last year. It's worth about $50 billion. And of course, he's using the same trick. The shares that his founder's shares for Palantir are sitting in the Roth IRA. In 2004, a year later, he meets Mark Zuckerberg and is one of the first investors in Facebook. So he invests $500,000 into Facebook. And where do the shares end up? Well, you guessed it. They're in the Roth IRA. And so he replicates and replicates the whole strategy year after year. In 2008, so this is 9 years after he initially contributed $1,700, his Roth IRA is worth $870 million. And then 2019, so this is exactly 20 years after the beginning, the initial contribution, his Roth IRA, after deploying the same strategy over and over, is worth $5 billion. And by the way, his Roth IRA at this point is so complicated and so spread out that he has 96 separate sub-accounts in there. So this is how you turn $1,700 in a simple Roth IRA, an account that is meant to help average regular Americans save for retirement. That's how you turn that money into a $5 billion account. Final couple of points I want to make here is that as much as I tip my hat off to Peter Thiel and we can debate the legality of what he did, I'm really hoping that he's going to use some of that money to do good and give back. But when it comes to the Roth IRA, this is an amazing retirement account that is definitely underused. Not many people focus on saving for retirement or saving using the right tools. And so the Roth IRA is an account that you should learn about, you should use. And you will find the benefits of it when you retire and you realize that you don't actually have to pay any taxes on whatever your investments grew up to. Anyway, thanks for hanging out today. Make sure you give a like to this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet, and I'll see you in a few days.